Claire never imagined her life would lead to this homeless, starving, invisible to the world. But everything changed when Alexander Sterling, a billionaire with power and secrets, offered her a deal: carry his child in exchange for wealth and security. Desperate and out of options, she agreed, thinking it was just a transaction. But when the baby was born, Alexander's face turned pale, his hands trembled, and in that moment, Claire realized the truth: this was never just about a child. Something far more terrifying was at play. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The rain poured mercilessly on the streets of New York, turning the sidewalks into rivers of filth and discarded dreams. Claire pulled her tattered coat tighter around her thin frame, seeking warmth that never seemed to come. She had learned to survive in the city's underbelly, where people like her were invisible ghosts of bad luck and forgotten pasts. She sat under the flickering neon light of a closed diner, knees drawn to her chest, watching the wealthy glide past in their polished shoes and designer coats. To them, she was nothing. Then he appeared. A black limousine rolled to a slow stop before her, its tinted window lowering just enough to reveal a man inside. His face was sharp, chiseled with an unnatural perfection, his blue eyes colder than the rain. He studied her with an expression she couldn't decipher: curiosity, perhaps? Pity. "Claire Evans," he said smoothly. Her breath hitched. Nobody had spoken her full name in years. "How do you know me?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I make it my business to know things." The door clicked open, an unspoken invitation. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But hunger, exhaustion, and desperation made her reckless. She slid inside. The warmth of the limousine was overwhelming, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. The man, immaculate in a tailored suit, handed her a silk napkin. She wiped the rain from her face, suddenly aware of how she must look: wild hair, gaunt cheeks, worn-out clothes. "I'm Alexander Drake." His voice was calm, measured. "I have a proposition for you." Claire narrowed her eyes. Rich men didn't just hand out opportunities. Not without a price. "I don't do anything illegal," she muttered. He chuckled, low and almost amused. "It's nothing like that. I need an heir." She frowned. "You need a what?" "A child. One that is unquestionably mine, with no legal ties to the mother." Her stomach twisted. "And you think I will pay you $5 million. Silence. The kind that wraps around your throat and refuses to let go. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs. $5 million. That wasn't just survival money, that was a way out. A way to erase every sleepless night, every bitter winter, every day spent scavenging for food. But at what cost? You could choose to disappear afterward, Alexander continued, his gaze unwavering. No obligations, no expectations. Just the money and your freedom. Freedom. The word tasted sweet on her tongue. "What's the catch?" she whispered. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "The child must be mine. No complications, no hidden secrets. It must be normal." Claire shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or anticipation. She should have said no. She should have bolted from the limousine and never looked back. Instead, she whispered, "Deal." And just like that, her fate was sealed. Claire sat in an office that smelled of polished wood and power, shifting uncomfortably in a chair that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned. The penthouse suite was eerily silent, except for the steady tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a city bathed in neon, towering skyscrapers and endless streets stretching below, like veins in a giant beast. Across from her, Alexander Drake sat behind an immaculate glass desk, watching her with the same calculated precision he had in the limousine. A man in a dark suit entered, carrying a thick folder. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward Claire. "The contract," Alexander said. Claire's fingers trembled as she reached for it. The paper was heavy, expensive. The first page alone made her pulse quicken. Surrogate agreement. The terms were clear. 1. She would conceive a child through in vitro fertilization. 2. She would receive $5 million, paid in installments throughout the pregnancy, with the final sum upon childbirth. 3. She would have no parental rights. No contact. No claim to the child. 4. If complications arose, if the child was not healthy, or normal, whatever that meant. Alexander had the right to terminate the agreement. Claire swallowed hard. "Do I get a lawyer?" she asked. "You may," Alexander replied, "but it won't change the terms." Her throat tightened. $5 million. That was more money than she could ever dream of. More than enough to disappear. To start over. "Why me?" she asked. Alexander leaned back, fingers steepled. "Because you have no ties. No family. No one who will complicate things. No one who will miss you." The unspoken words hung between them like a knife. Claire's stomach churned. She had spent years surviving, clawing her way through the cracks of a world that had already thrown her away. Maybe this was her one chance to escape. She took the pen. The ink bled onto the page, sealing her fate. 3 months later, Claire stood in front of the mirror in a bathroom bigger than the shelter she used to sleep in, staring at the pregnancy test in her shaking hands. Positive. Her breath came in sharp gasps. It was real now. No turning back. The door opened behind her. Alexander stepped inside, his gaze flicking to the test before meeting hers. His expression didn't change. No relief. No joy. Just cold, quiet satisfaction. "We'll schedule an ultrasound tomorrow," he said. Claire swallowed hard. "You don't seem very excited." "I don't do excitement," he said simply. She clenched her jaw. The arrangement was transactional. Nothing more. Still, she couldn't shake the unease creeping into her bones. Something wasn't right. 6 months later, Claire's belly swelled, a constant reminder that she was no longer just herself. She had avoided thinking about the child inside her as anything more than a deal, a contract in progress. But lately she had dreams. Strange, vivid dreams. A baby's laughter echoing through an empty mansion. A shadow standing at the foot of her bed, whispering in a voice she didn't recognize. A storm outside, lightning flashing, and in the mirror, her reflection smiling when she wasn't. She woke up gasping, sweat-soaked sheets tangled around her legs. Something was wrong. 8 months later, the nursery was pristine white walls, silver furniture, a crib fit for royalty. But something about it felt lifeless, sterile, like a dollhouse instead of a home. Claire stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around her belly. She could feel the baby kicking, restless. "I have a question," she said. Alexander looked up from his book. "What happens if I change my mind?" The room went silent. He closed the book slowly, setting it aside. "That would be a mistake," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. This wasn't just about money. It never had been. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And in that moment, she knew. She had made a deal with the devil. The pain was unbearable. Claire's screams echoed off the sterile white walls of the private hospital room. Sweat soaked her hospital gown, her fingers clutching the sheets as another contraction tore through her. The beeping of machines, the rustling of nurses, and the doctor's calm instructions blurred into a distant hum. She wasn't ready. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. Her due date was still 2 weeks away, but the baby had other plans. "You're doing great, Miss Evans," the doctor said, his voice too emotionless, too rehearsed. Claire gritted her teeth. She didn't feel great. She felt like she was dying. And through it all, Alexander stood there watching. He didn't speak, didn't flinch. His icy blue eyes remained locked on her, his hands folded neatly in front of him as if this were just another business transaction. Claire wanted to scream at him. Say something. Do something. But another contraction hit, and all rational thought disappeared. Time became meaningless minutes or hours, she couldn't tell. Then suddenly, a sharp cry split the air. The room fell into stunned silence. The doctor hesitated before holding up the newborn, his gloved hands trembling slightly. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. Claire forced herself to lift her head, breathless and drenched in sweat. She had expected relief, maybe even a strange sense of accomplishment. Instead, the room felt wrong. Something was wrong. Her baby was staring at her. Not wailing, not blindly searching for warmth like a newborn should. Just staring. Deep, knowing eyes. A gaze that sent ice through Claire's veins. The doctor cleared his throat, visibly unsettled. "Mr. Drake, But Alexander was already stepping forward. He smiled. For the first time since Claire had met him, he actually smiled. And it wasn't relief. It was recognition. The baby's eyes flicked from Claire to Alexander. Then it smiled back. A newborn. Smiling. Claire's breath caught in her throat. That wasn't normal. That wasn't human. She knew, with a terrible, gut-wrenching certainty, that she had made a mistake. This child, her child, was not just an heir. It was something else entirely. The baby didn't cry. That was the first sign. Newborns were supposed to scream, their tiny lungs desperate for air, their fragile bodies reacting to the shock of birth. But this child, her child, had come into the world in perfect silence, eyes open, watching. Claire could still feel its gaze, as if it understood something she didn't. A shiver crawled down her spine. "Is the baby okay?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. The doctor hesitated. The nurses weren't moving. It was as if an invisible force had stolen their words, their certainty. Then Alexander spoke. "He's perfect." Claire's head snapped toward him. He was smiling again, that eerie, knowing smile. The doctor, as if shaking off his unease, cleared his throat. "Of course. The baby appears healthy. Just unusually alert." Unusually alert. That was an understatement. A nurse wrapped the baby in a soft, white blanket and hesitated before handing him to Claire. She almost refused. Almost. But then she looked down and her breath caught. He was beautiful. Pale skin, soft golden curls, impossibly blue eyes. He barely moved, only blinking slowly as he studied her with an intensity that sent her stomach twisting. Something deep inside her, a primal, motherly instinct she never thought she had stirred. This was her baby. And yet, something felt wrong. 2 days later, the private hospital had discharged her early. Claire wasn't sure if it was normal, but nothing about this had been normal. She was taken back to the penthouse, her penthouse, for now, where nurses checked on the baby in strict intervals. But they never touched him more than necessary. Never lingered. She saw it in their eyes. Fear. And Claire couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something off about the child. She barely slept. Every time she woke up, she found him staring at her, completely still, his tiny hands resting on his chest like a king on a throne. And he never cried. Not when he was hungry. Not when he was wet. Not even when he woke up. Just silence. Watching. Like he was waiting. 1 week later, Claire snapped awake in the middle of the night, heart pounding. The baby was in his crib across the room. She knew that. She had put him there herself. But something felt wrong. The air was thick. Heavy. The kind of silence that hummed in your ears. Slowly, Claire turned her head and froze. He was right there. The baby was on the bed, lying beside her. Watching her. Her breath hitched. "H, how did you get here?" she whispered. Her hands shook as she reached for him, lifting him gently, pressing him against her chest. His tiny body was warm, real. But the question remained. How had he moved? She stared at the crib across the room. It was untouched. Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. And then just for a second she swore she heard something. A whisper. Soft. Almost amused. Her blood turned to ice. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And Claire was beginning to fear that her child wasn't human. Alexander knows something. The next morning, Claire stormed into Alexander's office, the baby cradled tightly in her arms. His expression didn't change when he saw her, as if he had been expecting this. "You knew," Claire accused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't you?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes locked onto the child. Then, calmly, he said, "What exactly do you think I knew?" Claire's grip tightened. "Something is wrong with him." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. Then he stood and walked toward her, his movements measured, deliberate. When he reached out, Claire hesitated before reluctantly handing over the baby. Alexander held the child with an ease that sent a chill down her spine. For the first time, the baby cooed. Not at her. At him. Claire felt sick. "Claire," Alexander said softly, "you have no idea what you've given birth to." Claire's stomach twisted. "You have no idea what you've given birth to." Alexander's words hung in the air like a curse. She watched as he cradled the baby with practiced ease. The baby, her baby, who had never made a sound, who had never cried, now cooed in his arms, tiny fingers reaching up to touch Alexander's face. The sight made something primal rise inside her. Fear. a mother's instinct screaming at her that something was deeply, unnaturally wrong. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Alexander exhaled softly, brushing a golden curl away from the baby's forehead. When he looked back at Claire, his blue eyes were unreadable. "You should sit down." "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Tell me. Now." A long silence. Then, "This child," he said, "was never meant for you." Claire's breath hitched. "What the hell does that mean?" she demanded. Alexander turned, walking toward the large window overlooking the city skyline. The baby was still in his arms, impossibly still, impossibly watching. "You weren't chosen at random," he said finally. "Everything, our meeting, the contract, even the pregnancy was planned." Planned. The word made her dizzy. "This wasn't just about an heir," Alexander continued. "It was about something much older, much more important." Claire felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Older than what?" Alexander finally turned to face her. "Older than me. Older than the city. Older than you could ever comprehend." Her skin prickled. She took a step back. "You're insane." He smiled faintly. "You'd like to believe that." She clenched her fists. "This is just a baby. My baby. Whatever game you're playing." "He's not yours," Alexander interrupted. His voice was gentle, almost pitying. "Not really." Claire's breath stilled. Alexander walked toward her, lowering his voice. "This child is not just a child," he said. "He is a promise fulfilled." Claire's heart pounded. "A promise to who?" Alexander's expression darkened. "To something that's finally waking up." Claire couldn't breathe. She looked down at the baby in Alexander's arms. The baby that had never cried, never acted like a normal infant. The baby that had somehow appeared on her bed without explanation. And she remembered the whisper she had heard the night before. Soft, amused. "Tell me you're joking," she whispered. Alexander didn't answer. Instead, the baby turned its head toward her and smiled, a deep, knowing smile. Claire staggered backward, heart slamming against her ribs. "No," she murmured. "No, this isn't real." A sharp gust of wind blasted through the penthouse, rattling the windows. The lights flickered, and in that moment, Claire felt it. A presence. Something watching them. Something that had been waiting. Claire's legs moved before she could think. She lunged toward Alexander, grabbing the baby out of his arms, clutching him against her chest. Alexander's expression didn't change. He didn't try to stop her. "Where do you think you'll go?" he asked, voice calm. Claire's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. "I don't know," she admitted. But she knew one thing. She had to get away. She didn't care if she had signed a contract. She didn't care about the $5 million. She was this child's mother, and no thing was taking him from her. Ignoring Alexander's voice calling after her, she ran. Out of the office, down the hallway, through the penthouse doors, and as she sprinted into the night, clutching the silent, smiling baby against her chest. She had no idea that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. The city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow as Claire ran. She didn't stop to think, didn't stop to breathe. Her only thought was escape. Her baby was silent in her arms. Not crying, not fussing, just watching. The way he always did. She couldn't think about that now. She had to get away from Alexander, from the penthouse, from whatever the hell was happening. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. She hailed a cab, breathless, barely able to choke out. "Just drive." The driver gave her a suspicious glance, but pulled into traffic without a word. For a moment, Claire let herself believe she was safe. She was wrong. The city lights flickered as they passed, plunging the streets into momentary darkness before flashing back to life. Something felt off. Claire's heart pounded. The baby lay nestled against her chest, impossibly still. Too still. Then, the streetlights went out. All at once. A blackout. The cab jerked to a stop. "Damn it," the driver muttered. "Not again." Claire barely heard him, because in the darkness outside, she saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Staring. Unblinking. Glowing faintly in the shadows. Watching her. Watching the baby. Her breath hitched. The driver reached for his phone. "Let me check the..." And then something slammed into the car. Hard. The impact sent the vehicle skidding sideways, glass shattering, metal shrieking. Claire screamed, shielding the baby with her body. The cab spun out of control before finally screeching to a stop. Everything went silent. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. The driver groaned, dazed but alive. What the hell was that? Claire didn't answer, because outside the cracked windshield, the eyes were still there. Closer now. Too close. And then, they started to move. Toward her. Claire's instincts screamed at her to run. She threw open the car door, clutching the baby tightly as she stumbled onto the wet pavement. The air was thick. Wrong. Like the whole city was holding its breath. The shadows shifted. Shapes moved at the edges of her vision. Figures too tall, too thin, their limbs too long, their movements too smooth. They weren't human. They never had been. And they were coming for the child. Claire turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted through the empty streets. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. But the whispers followed her. Soft, hissing voices curling around her like smoke. Give him back. He is not yours. He was promised to us. Claire's chest tightened. The whispers weren't coming from behind her. They were coming from inside her head. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself forward. She had to keep moving. She had to. Bam! Something hit her. Hard. The world spun. The baby was ripped from her arms. She hit the ground, pain exploding through her body. Her vision blurred, head pounding. And when she looked up, Alexander was there, standing above her, holding the child in his arms. Calm, unshaken, as if he had been waiting for this. Claire gasped, struggling to sit up. No. Alexander sighed. I told you, Claire. You can't run from this. His voice was gentle, almost pitying. Claire's hands shook. Who the hell are you? Alexander tilted his head, studying her. Then, softly, he said, I am the one who made the deal. The words hit her like ice. The deal, she echoed, barely able to get the words out. Alexander nodded. The child was never yours to keep. You were just the vessel. The contract was always about something greater. Claire's blood ran cold. No, she whispered. I didn't agree to. But you did. Alexander's voice was almost amused now. You signed the contract, Claire. And now the child belongs to them. Behind him, the shadows shifted. The figures emerged, moving closer. Claire's heart pounded. She couldn't let them take him. She wouldn't. Ignoring the pain, she lunged at Alexander, reaching for the baby. But before she could touch him, Alexander simply stepped back, and the shadows swallowed them both. The silence was deafening. The air was still. Claire fell to her knees, gasping for breath. They were gone. Alexander, the baby, the figures, everything. Her arms felt empty. Too empty. Her whole body trembled as the realization sank in. She had failed. The baby, her baby, was gone. And Claire had no idea where they had taken him. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And Claire would burn the whole world down to get him back. Claire is alone. But she's not giving up. She doesn't care what Alexander is. She doesn't care what the child truly is. She just wants him back. And she will do anything to find him. Even if it means going straight into the darkness herself. Claire's body trembled as she knelt on the wet pavement. The city lights flickered back on, as if nothing had happened. As if the world hadn't just been ripped apart. As if her child, the baby she had carried, birthed, and held in her arms, hadn't just vanished into the shadows. But he had. And Claire was alone. A car honked. Someone swore from a distant alley. The normal sounds of a city returned. The cab driver, the one who had nearly died with her minutes ago, groaned as he climbed out of his wrecked car. Lady, are you? But Claire didn't answer. She stood, cold fury burning through her veins. Alexander had taken her child. He had planned this from the start. She had been nothing more than a pawn in some game she didn't understand. She wasn't playing anymore. She was fighting back. Claire didn't go home. She had no home. The penthouse wasn't hers. The contract was a lie. She only had one goal now, find Alexander. Find the child. But how? She barely knew anything about him. She had no phone, no money, nothing but the clothes on her back. And yet, a memory surfaced. Something Alexander had said before everything fell apart. The child was never meant for you. It was about something older. Older than him. Older than the city. That meant history. That meant records. That meant someone had to know the truth. She needed answers. And she knew exactly where to start. The city library was one of the oldest buildings still standing. Marble columns. High ceilings. Dim lighting. The kind of place that held secrets. Claire walked in, trying to ignore the way people stared at her disheveled state. She went straight to the historical archives. An elderly librarian gave her a wary glance. "Can I help you?" Claire forced a smile. "I'm looking for old city records. Something about powerful families. Ones with deep roots." The librarian hesitated, then nodded. She led Claire down a narrow hallway to a dusty room filled with forgotten history. "Anything specific?" Claire swallowed. "The name Alexander Hale." The woman frowned. "Hale? That's—" She trailed off, but Claire saw it in her eyes. She knew something. The librarian hesitated, then slowly walked to one of the oldest shelves, pulling down a massive leather-bound book. She flipped through the pages, her expression darkening. Then she stopped, pointed, and said the words that sent ice through Claire's veins. "There has always been an Alexander Hale." Claire stared at the records. The first Alexander Hale was listed in 1812, another in 1899, another in 1935, another in 1980, and all of them looked exactly the same. Same name, same face, same piercing blue eyes. Impossible. Claire's heartbeat thundered. "What is he?" she whispered. The librarian closed the book. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever he is, he's not human." Claire stumbled back, her mind racing. Alexander had taken the baby, a baby he had designed, planned, for them, for something waking up, and she had signed the contract without realizing what she had agreed to. Her hands clenched into fists. No. No matter what Alexander was, no matter what she had unknowingly birthed. He was still her child, and Claire was going to get him back, even if it meant facing something older than time itself. Claire now knows that Alexander isn't human. But what is he? And what does he need the child for? Her only option is to track him down before it's too late. But will she survive what comes next? The librarian's words echoed in Claire's mind. There has always been an Alexander Hale. She slammed the book shut. The weight of what she had just learned settled deep in her chest, suffocating her. Alexander wasn't just a man. He was something else, something that had been alive for centuries. And he had taken her child. The librarian shifted uneasily. "This is dangerous knowledge," she said. "I shouldn't have shown you." Claire tightened her grip on the book. "Then tell me the rest." "There is no rest," the woman said quickly. "Only warnings. People who dig into the name Hale disappear." Claire's pulse pounded. "Who takes them?" she demanded. The librarian hesitated, then whispered. "Not who. What?" A chill ran down Claire's spine. The librarian glanced at the doors as if expecting someone to burst in. Then she lowered her voice. "There are stories," she murmured. "Legends of a family older than the city itself. The Hales are mentioned in records from before this place was even built." Claire swallowed hard. She had lived on these streets for years. She had seen the worst the city had to offer. But this was different. This wasn't just money or power. This was something else entirely. Claire leaned in. "What do they want?" The librarian hesitated, then pushed the book aside and took out an older one, bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed with age. She flipped it open to a section near the middle and pointed to a single word, a name. Not Alexander, not Hale, something far older. Claire's stomach turned to ice as she read it. Claire whispered it aloud. The air seemed to shudder. The lights overhead flickered. The librarian's breath hitched. "You shouldn't have said it." Claire frowned. "Why? What does it mean?" But before the woman could answer, the building shook. A deep, unnatural groaning sound echoed through the walls. Bookshelves rattled. Dust rained from the ceiling. And then, the lights died. Claire's pulse spiked. "What the hell?" The librarian backed away. "You need to leave," she whispered. "Now." Claire's instincts screamed at her to run. She turned toward the exit and froze, because in the shadows between the bookshelves, something was watching her. Eyes, not human, glowing faintly in the dark. And then, the whispers began. Soft, curling words in a language Claire didn't understand. But she knew what they meant. They were calling for the child. Claire bolted. She tore through the darkened library, shoving past shelves and stacks of forgotten books. The whispers followed her. The eyes followed her. She reached the entrance,